The room was silent. No crowd. No advisor. No general standing at his shoulder with a map. Just a man, 39 years old, emperor of the most powerful civilization on earth, sitting alone by candlelight, writing to himself. Not orders. Not decrees. Not speeches for the Senate. He was writing things like, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Marcus Aurelius didn't write the Meditations to be published. He wrote them because he understood something most men never grasp, that the most important conversations you will ever have are the ones you have with yourself, alone, in the dark, when no one is watching and no one is keeping score. He ruled an empire. He led armies. He sat at the apex of human power. And the place he did his greatest work was inside a quiet room, alone with his thoughts. This is the video that Channel Inner Steel was made to produce. Because today we are not talking about networking. We are not talking about finding your tribe or building your circle or surrounding yourself with the right people. Today we are talking about something older. Something harder. Something most men in this generation have completely lost. The ability to think alone. To stand alone. To conquer alone. Stay with me. Because what I'm about to share will not make you popular. It will not go viral in your friend group. But if you internalize it, truly internalize it, it will change the architecture of your life. Point 1. The man who thinks for himself is the most dangerous man alive. There is a kind of man the world fears. Not the loudest man. Not the richest man. Not the man with the most followers or the most friends. The man the world fears is the man who has learned to think for himself. In the early 1800s, a young American writer named Ralph Waldo Emerson watched something that disturbed him deeply. He watched brilliant men, educated men, accomplished men, outsource their thinking. They quoted other men's ideas as though they were their own. They borrowed opinions. They formed their worldview not through reflection, but through repetition. They believed whatever the room they were standing in believed. Emerson sat with this. He thought about it alone. And then he wrote one of the most defiant essays in American literary history, Self-Reliance, in which he said, "To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius." Read that again. To believe what is true for you in your private heart. Not what Twitter says. Not what your friends say. Not what your family expects. Not what the culture has decided is acceptable this week. Your private heart. But here is the problem. Most men have been so thoroughly colonized by outside voices that they no longer know what their private heart actually thinks. They have spent so many years performing for the crowd, laughing at the right moments, agreeing at the right moments, nodding along, that they have lost access to their own interior. They are strangers to themselves. Emerson called this the hobgoblin of little minds, the desperate need to be consistent with what others think of you, even at the cost of your own truth. The man who thinks alone is dangerous because he cannot be manipulated by consensus. You cannot move him with social pressure. You cannot shame him into compliance. You cannot make him doubt himself simply by making the crowd louder. He has already interrogated his own beliefs in the silence. He has already pressure-tested his own thinking when no one was watching. The crowd's noise is just weather to him. It passes. Start thinking alone. Not as a performance of independence, but as a discipline. Sit with your own mind. Question what you believe and why. Most of what you think you believe, you have inherited from someone else. The man who knows his own mind cannot be owned. Point 2. Solitude is not loneliness. It is where power is built. There is a story about Nikola Tesla that most people don't know. At the height of his fame, when he was delivering lectures to packed rooms, when kings and industrialists were seeking his company, when Thomas Edison himself was watching him with a mixture of awe and envy, Tesla spent the majority of his hours completely alone. Not because he was antisocial. Not because he was strange or broken. But because he understood something about the relationship between solitude and genius. Tesla once said, "The mind is sharper and keener in seclusion and uninterrupted solitude." Originality thrives in seclusion, free of outside influences beating upon us to cripple the creative mind. He did his greatest thinking in hotel rooms. In the silence between midnight and 4 in the morning. He would walk alone for hours, not aimlessly, but architecturally, building entire electrical systems inside his mind before a single wire was ever laid. The alternating current that powers the modern world was conceived in a man's solitary mind before it existed anywhere else. Now contrast that with the modern man. The modern man is terrified of silence. He fills every quiet moment with noise, podcasts, music, scrolling, texting, talking. He has mistaken constant stimulation for aliveness. He has confused busyness with productivity. And he has confused being surrounded by people with being powerful. But here is what no one tells you: loneliness and solitude are not the same experience. Loneliness is the pain of unwanted isolation. Solitude is the choice to be alone, and it is where every great mind in history has done its deepest work. Marcus Aurelius, Isaac Newton, Dostoevsky, Darwin. All of them were known to disappear into long periods of solitude not because the world rejected them, but because they chose the silence. They understood that the mind produces its best work when it is not competing with the noise of other minds for dominance. When you are constantly surrounded, constantly plugged in, constantly available, constantly responsive, you are not thinking. You are reacting. There is a difference. Reaction is fast and shallow. Thinking is slow and deep. Begin to treat your solitude as sacred. Not as something to endure or escape, but as something to protect. It is not dead time. It is the time when your best self is being assembled. If you haven't already, subscribe to Inner Steel. This channel exists for the man who is serious about building himself, from the inside out. Point 3. The crowd will never lead you where you were meant to go. In 1903, the Wright brothers stood in a field in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and launched a machine into the sky. Before that moment, before the 12 seconds of flight that changed everything, virtually every expert on Earth had declared the dream impossible. The Smithsonian Institution had already funded another man's attempt and dismissed the Wright brothers entirely. The press didn't cover it. The scientific community wasn't watching. Wilbur and Orville Wright were bicycle mechanics from Ohio. No formal education in physics. No prestigious backing. No crowd cheering them on. There were exactly 5 witnesses at Kitty Hawk that morning. 5. And the world barely noticed for years afterward. The New York Times ignored it. The military showed no interest. The crowd, the consensus, had already decided it was impossible. The Wright brothers didn't care. They went back to work. Here is what history keeps trying to teach us and what we keep refusing to learn. The crowd is always wrong about the things that matter most. Not because the crowd is evil, but because the crowd is averaging. The crowd moves at the speed of the slowest mind. The crowd's consensus is built on what is already known, already tested, already safe. The crowd cannot see past the edge of its own comfort zone. But you, if you have the courage, can see further. Every man who has ever built something extraordinary has had to endure a period where the crowd laughed. Edison was told the light bulb was a fantasy. Einstein failed his university entrance exam. J.K. Rowling was rejected by 12 publishers. Every one of these people had a moment, a long, dark, humiliating moment, where the crowd was certain they were wrong. And every one of them had to make a decision: trust the crowd, or trust themselves. The crowd cannot tell you what you are capable of. The crowd does not have access to your interior. The crowd sees your current performance, not your potential. The crowd sees where you are, not where you could go. Stop letting the crowd set the ceiling. Stand alone in your vision. Not arrogantly. Not blindly. But with the calm certainty of a man who has done the interior work and knows what he is building. Point 4. When you stop seeking approval, you become unstoppable. Epictetus was a slave. Not metaphorically. Not philosophically. An actual slave, owned by a man named Epaphroditus in Rome, during one of the most brutal periods in Roman history. He had no freedom of movement. No political rights. No property. No status. He could be sold. He could be beaten. He could be killed. And yet, Epictetus became one of the most powerful minds in recorded history. His teachings shaped Marcus Aurelius. His philosophy has outlasted every emperor who ever ruled Rome. How? Because Epictetus understood something that his captors never grasped. You cannot own a man's mind. He wrote, or rather, his student Arian wrote on his behalf. Seek not the good in external things, seek it in yourself. External validation. External approval. External permission. Epictetus, a man who had literally nothing, understood that chasing any of those things was the real slavery. Not the chains on his body. The chains that men voluntarily place on their own minds by making their sense of worth dependent on other people's opinions. Think about how many decisions you have made, or not made, based on what others might think. The business you didn't start because you were afraid people would say you failed. The relationship you stayed in too long because leaving would look bad. The path you didn't take because it wasn't what your parents had in mind. The opinion you didn't voice because the room might not approve. Every one of those moments was a moment of voluntary captivity. You gave someone else the key to your own cage. The Stoics were obsessed with this distinction, what they called the dichotomy of control. The things within your power, and the things outside it. Your thoughts, your choices, your actions, these are yours. Other people's opinions, reactions, judgments, these are not yours. They never were. The moment you genuinely internalize this, not as a concept, but as a lived truth, something shifts. The weight of other people's expectations lifts off your shoulders. You stop performing. You stop auditioning for roles in other people's stories. You start, perhaps for the first time, living your own. When you stop seeking approval, you stop being controllable. And an uncontrollable man, a man who cannot be moved by shame or social pressure or the threat of rejection, is, by any measure, unstoppable. Point 5. Pain endured alone becomes wisdom. Pain shared too quickly becomes weakness. Viktor Frankl arrived at Auschwitz in 1942. He had been a psychiatrist in Vienna. He had a manuscript, years of work, hidden in the lining of his coat. The guards found it on the first day and destroyed it. He watched his mother, his father, his brother, and his wife die in the camps. He had nothing. He was nothing, by the world's definition. A number tattooed on his arm. A prisoner in the most savage system ever devised by man. And yet, Frankl observed something inside the camps that would define the rest of his life and eventually save millions. He watched men break, men who had been strong, capable, vital, within weeks of arrival. And he watched other men endure years of unimaginable suffering and emerge not just intact, but somehow more themselves. The difference, he concluded, was not strength in the conventional sense. It was meaning. The men who broke were the men who had no inner life to retreat to. No anchor. No narrative that could hold them through the horror. The men who endured were the men who had developed, through years of interior work, a relationship with their own suffering that transcended the suffering itself. Frankl wrote afterward, in Man's Search for Meaning. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. His suffering was not something he processed publicly, in the moment, to a crowd. It was something he held alone, turned over in his mind alone, and transmuted alone into understanding. This is a truth that the modern culture of emotional immediacy has completely inverted. Today we are told, share your pain immediately. Post it. Talk about it. Process it out loud, publicly, in real time. Vulnerability is strength, we are told. Openness is power. And there is a grain of truth in that. Connection matters, and men do suffer in silence in destructive ways. But there is also a profound danger in the opposite extreme. When you process every wound publicly and immediately, you deprive yourself of the interior alchemy that turns pain into wisdom. Some suffering is meant to be sat with. Alone. In the quiet. Not to isolate you, but to forge you. There is a version of you that only gets built in the dark. A version that can only emerge from the crucible of private, unwitnessed endurance. If you immediately pour that experience out to others, you lose the forge. You get comfort, perhaps, but you miss the transformation. Endure some things alone. Not all things. Not forever. But some things, the deep things, are meant to be processed in solitude, on your own terms, in your own time. On the other side of that silence is a man the comfortable crowd will never understand, because they never paid the price he paid. Point 6. The man who needs an audience has already lost. In 480 BC, at the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae, 300 Spartan warriors chose to die. They knew, from the beginning, that they would die. There was no strategic illusion. There was no plan for rescue. There was no cavalry coming. Leonidas and his 300 men looked at a Persian army that numbered, by ancient accounts, in the hundreds of thousands, and they chose to stand. Not for the crowd. Not for glory. Not because anyone was recording it. They stood because that is what Spartans did. That is who they had built themselves to be. The story only became legend afterward. In the moment, there was no audience. There was just 300 men, a narrow pass, and a decision made in the deepest silence of the soul: we will not move. The Spartan system of training, the agoge, was specifically designed to produce men who did not need external motivation. Men who did not need a crowd to cheer them into action. Men who had so thoroughly internalized their values that the presence or absence of an audience was irrelevant. This is the opposite of the modern man. The modern man documents everything. He trains for the Instagram post. He works hard for the LinkedIn update. He makes sacrifices that he then immediately announces. And without the audience, without the likes, the comments, the validation, the motivation evaporates. This is not strength. This is the most sophisticated form of weakness. Because it means your actions are controlled not by your values, but by the approval of others. Take the audience away and the man collapses. The Spartans understood that a man must do the right thing even when, especially when, no one is watching. Marcus Aurelius, again, wrote, "Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect." Your self-respect. Not your public reputation. Your self-respect. There is a version of excellence that has nothing to do with recognition. There is a version of discipline that is entirely private. There is a version of integrity that operates in the dark, where no one can see it, no one can applaud it, and the only witness is you. Build that version of yourself. Because when the audience disappears, and it always eventually disappears, the man who needed it has nothing left. And the man who never needed it has everything. Point 7. Independence is built, not born. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in 1818 on a Maryland plantation. He did not know his birthday. He barely knew his mother. He was separated from her as an infant, a common practice designed specifically to prevent the emotional bonds that create resistance. The system was engineered, deliberately, to produce men who could not imagine themselves free. And for years it worked. But at 12 years old, Douglass encountered something that cracked the architecture of his captivity open: a book. Specifically, the Columbian Orator, a collection of speeches and dialogues, many of them about freedom, about the rights of man, about the dignity of the human being. He read it alone. Secretly. In stolen moments. And something happened that his captors could not reverse. He began to think. Not in the language of his masters. Not in the logic of his captivity. He began to think in his own voice, using his own mind, asking his own questions. And once that began, once the interior world ignited, nothing could contain him. Douglass later wrote, in his autobiography, "Once you learn to read, you will be forever free." But he wasn't talking only about literacy. He was talking about the broader capacity, the capacity to think independently, to engage with ideas on your own terms, to form conclusions through your own reasoning rather than through the permission of authority. Frederick Douglass escaped slavery. He became the most prominent abolitionist in American history. He advised presidents. He changed the course of his nation. And it all began with a book, read alone, in secret, by a boy who decided that his mind belonged to him. Here is the lesson. Independence, genuine independence of mind and spirit, is not something you are born with. It is something you build, slowly, through the discipline of solitary thinking. Through reading. Through reflection. Through the willingness to sit alone with hard questions and stay with them until they yield answers. Most men never build this capacity. They are too impatient. They want answers immediately, from outside sources, delivered to them pre-packaged and easy to consume. They outsource their thinking to the loudest voices in the room. But you cannot outsource your interior. You cannot borrow another man's clarity. You have to build your own, alone, over time, through the slow and unglamorous discipline of thinking for yourself. This takes years. But the man who builds it is free in a way that no external circumstance can touch. And if this channel has added anything to that process for you, if inner steel has been a voice in your solitary thinking, then subscribe. Share this with one man who needs it. Not for the numbers. Because this work matters. Point 8. Standing alone is the test that separates the built from the borrowed. In 1633, Galileo Galilei stood before the Roman Inquisition. He was 69 years old. His health was failing. Behind him was a lifetime of work, the telescope, the moons of Jupiter, the evidence of a heliocentric universe that contradicted centuries of church doctrine. The Inquisition gave him a choice: recant, or face torture and death. He recanted. He publicly declared that the earth did not move around the sun. He said the words they wanted to hear. He was placed under house arrest for the remaining 9 years of his life. And yet, and this is the part that history cannot erase, the truth he had discovered did not change. The moons of Jupiter kept orbiting. The earth kept moving. His private journals kept documenting reality, even when his public testimony denied it. There is a legend, almost certainly apocryphal, but immortally resonant, that as Galileo rose from his knees after his recantation, he murmured under his breath, "And yet it moves!" Whether he said it or not, the spirit is true. Some truths do not require public declaration to remain true. Some stands are taken in the interior, in the private commitment to what you know to be real, regardless of what the crowd demands you say. Now, the lesson here is not about martyrdom. It is not about dying on every hill. Galileo's recantation was a survival decision, and there is wisdom in that. But here is what standing alone truly means. It means that your internal conviction does not bend with the social wind. It means that you can be pressured publicly without being altered internally. It means that you know the difference between strategic silence and fundamental capitulation, and you never cross that line. Most men cannot do this. Most men, under enough social pressure, under enough ridicule, under enough isolation, eventually fold. Not because they are cowards, necessarily, but because they never did the interior work required to hold their own ground. They never spent enough time alone with their own convictions, pressure testing them, clarifying them, making them granite instead of sand. When the crowd turns on you, and at some point in your life, if you are living authentically, it will. The only thing standing between you and capitulation is the depth of your interior. Build it now, before the test comes. The men who stand alone when it counts are not men who discovered bravery in the moment. They are men who spent years, in solitude, becoming certain of who they are. Point 9. Conquering alone means taking full ownership of your life, every part of it. The year is 1519. Hernán Cortés lands on the eastern coast of what is now Mexico with approximately 500 soldiers. They are outnumbered by forces that number in the hundreds of thousands. The terrain is unknown. The supplies are limited. The mission is objectively insane by the calculus of conventional military strategy. And Cortés, by legend, orders the ships burned. No retreat. No fallback. No option but forward. Now, the historical ethics of the conquistadors are complex, and the brutal reality of what followed is not the point of this story. What matters here is the principle embedded in that decision. When you burn your ships, when you remove the option of retreat, something changes in the human mind. The cognitive resources that were previously divided between moving forward and preparing to fall back are now unified. All of them point in one direction: conquer. This is what it means to take full ownership of your life. Not the comfortable, hedged, one foot in and one foot out version of commitment that most men practice. The kind where you start the business but keep the job as insurance. The kind where you pursue the relationship but leave the door open for the exit. The kind where you begin the transformation but keep the old identity as a costume you can put back on if things get hard. Real ownership, radical ownership, means burning the ships. It means deciding, clearly and finally, that you are the sole architect of your outcome. Not your parents. Not your past. Not your circumstances. Not the economy, the system, the people who hurt you, or the luck you didn't get. You. This is the most empowering and the most terrifying truth available to a man. Empowering, because it means you are never permanently at the mercy of anything outside yourself. Terrifying, because it removes every excuse. When you take full ownership, you can no longer blame the world for where you are. You can only ask, what am I going to do about it? Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher and advisor to emperors, wrote, "It is not that I am brave. It is that I know what deserves to be feared. And what deserves to be feared is not failure. Not ridicule. Not standing alone while the crowd moves in another direction. What deserves to be feared is reaching the end of your life and realizing that you lived it for someone else. That the story of your existence was written by other people's expectations, other people's timelines, other people's definitions of success. That is the thing to fear. Conquer alone does not mean conquer without help. It does not mean refusing guidance, refusing collaboration, refusing the wisdom of others. It means that the ownership of your outcome rests with you and no one else. It means that when you win, you genuinely won it. And when you lose, you genuinely learn from it. No shared credit with fate. No divided blame with the world. Full ownership. Full accountability. Full conquest. Closing. We have covered 9 principles today. That thinking alone is the foundation of a life that belongs to you. That solitude is not emptiness, it is where power is assembled quietly, without applause. That the crowd will always move toward the average, and if you move with it, you will become average. That the need for approval is the cage that most men never recognize as a cage. That pain endured alone, held and processed in the interior, becomes a form of wisdom that cannot be borrowed or shortcut. That a man who needs an audience to act with integrity has no integrity. That independence of mind is built, slowly, through the discipline of solitary thinking. That standing alone under pressure is the test that reveals whether your convictions are your own or borrowed. And that conquering alone means claiming full ownership of your life, every part of it, including the parts you didn't choose. These are not comfortable ideas. They are not designed to make you feel good in the short term. They are designed to make you free in the long term. Marcus Aurelius, in the quiet of his tent, writing to no one but himself, expressed it like this: "The first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit. The second is to look things in the face and know them for what they are. Untroubled. Not because the world cooperated. Not because things went smoothly. Not because the crowd approved or the circumstances aligned. Untroubled because he had done the interior work. Because he had thought alone, stood alone, and built within himself something that the external world could not reach. That is the invitation of this video. That is the standard of inner steel. Not popularity. Not applause. Not the shallow validation of a crowd that will forget your name in a week. The deep, permanent, unshakable architecture of a man who knows himself, who built himself, who answers to himself, and who can therefore give something real to the world. Think alone. Stand alone. Conquer alone. Subscribe to Inner Steel. Not for the content. For the commitment, to yourself, to your standard, to the version of you that exists on the other side of the work most men refuse to do. We will see you in the next one.